Today we're taking a look at something a little bit different. This is a 2025 Polaris Ranger Extreme Duty 1500 North Star Edition, which is a really long way of saying, think of this as the 3/4 ton truck of the utility side-by-side segment. You will find bigger and more capable utility side-by-sides out there, but this is way above average, as is its price tag, of course. This model started at $40,000 approximately, and this model definitely has some extra options on it. I'm glad though they sent me the 3-seat version because the 6-seat version might be just a little bit too big for where we're going today. I live on 13 acres out here in the Santa Cruz Mountains and I use my side-by-side all the time, but I bought a Kawasaki for 2 reasons. A, it was really cheap, significantly less expensive than this. Of course, it feels cheap, so we'll get into that in a moment, but also because it is small, and this just barely fits on some of my trails. I really don't intend this video to be Polaris versus Kawasaki. I'm just using my side-by-side as a frame for reference for this particular model. Now, versus the average $20,000 to maybe even $25,000, $30,000 side-by-side, you're going to find more protection and more basically off-road capability in something like this. We find this big steel bumper up front, big recovery hooks, very pickup truck like that. We get a winch that's rated higher. You actually have the choice of 2 different winches right from the factory on this model. And we get a little bit more underbody protection and what appears to be sturdier components under there as far as the cross beams, the suspension components, etc. Then you'll notice we have definitely bigger tires, especially versus some of those smaller side-by-sides. And that's why we need the bigger engine in the back, because we need more torque to be able to go through sticky situations with these big tires. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons that the diesel Wrangler was popular with people aftermarket, because if you put big tires in your vehicle, you're going to notice a severe change in your mechanical advantage. So you need more torque or different gearing in order to make that work. And of course, this was designed for these tires. So this is a 30 by 11 tire here, 30 by 11 R15. So definitely bigger wheels than we find on some of those small options. To check out the engine, I have to take this weekend's supplies out of the back. Been working on an addition project, so this is full of framing nails, framer, random Ethernet spools, hammers, cargo tie downs, all sorts of random things, and you know, Bosch hammer drill as well. Anyway, let's now power this open, because absolutely nothing is handier than a side-by-side with a powered dump bed. And I say that with some experience. My parents have a ranch in Texas. They've always had John Deere Gators, and my dad's usually too cheap to buy the ones with the powered dump. Definitely something I would get if I were shopping for a side-by-side. I don't know if I need 110 horsepower though. This has a 1.5 liter 3-cylinder naturally aspirated engine producing 110 horsepower, 105 pound-feet of torque, and it's not exactly a quiet engine. I'll start it up so you can see. I don't know if I'd call it loud, but not exactly quiet. And it definitely gets loud when you rev it. That makes sense, of course, because this engine has the same number of cylinders and same displacement as the Ford Bronco Sport. Obviously, it doesn't have a turbo like that Ford does, but the exhaust system is really quite small and compact behind, so definitely a little less sound deadening. I appreciate the fact that even though the air intake is up front, they put the air cleaner here so it's easier to service. We also have an easy to locate fuel filter on the side. The transmission, that's a little bit harder because it's basically under the cab. It is a CVT, just like most side-by-sides out there use, but this one is all steel belted, they say. So the belt is more like a regular passenger car CVT with an all steel belt, unlike many CVTs out there in the side-by-side segment that either use rubber elements or combination of rubber and steel elements in their belts. I have to admit, I would love to see a pickup truck with a tilt bed like that. On the other hand, I would not be so big of a fan of a pickup truck with suicide doors. There is seemingly a logical reason in a side-by-side like this. I do seem to, however, prefer more traditional door arrangements. The reason is you can get in and out without the door being quite as wide. So in tighter situations where you're up against a hillside or a building or something like that, you can more easily squeak in and out than the regular opening doors that we find in some utility vehicles, mainly due to the positioning of the seat. Of course, if you don't want doors, you don't need to get them. If you don't want windows, you can get half doors. If you don't want glass, you don't have to get that, etc. Basically, like most utility side-by-sides, you can get the Ranger without any of the glass or the doors that you see here. With the exception of vanity mirrors, the interior is very pickup truck-like. We even have a rear view mirror here, controls for the backup light, whether you want it to come on automatically in reverse or just use that as a utility light in the back, and there's even a tiny little dome light in here. Behind that door right there, we find some 12-volt power cables, clearly marked. You can get this as either a 3 or a 6-seat vehicle. This is the 3-seat vehicle, so we can fold up these seats and then have access to some cutouts where you can actually strap down a 5-gallon bucket. I do find some of those touches really handy. There's a little tiny storage compartment there under the seats, cup holders where we currently have a Sony lens, and then if we move on over to the dashboard, we even have a dual glove box arrangement, kind of like a pickup truck. More of a slot style there, North Star logo, and then a glove compartment on top with a little rubber weather seal to help make sure your manuals don't get wet. The air vents, and this one even has the optional JBL audio system, and the glass opens, and there's also a windshield wiper up there, just in case you're wondering, and yep, you can wipe even if that window is up in that position. Some little storage or knick-knack areas there. We have a touchscreen infotainment system with, of course, Bluetooth audio there. There's also navigation, just in case you're wondering, and of course you can get some auxiliary gauges in here as well if you'd rather be looking at that rather than the gauge cluster front and center. Down here we have the controls for the HVAC system, yep, heating and ventilation, and also heated seats. So if I click up in here, you notice we have heated driver and front passenger seats. Kind of a nifty little touch there. Controls for the windshield wipers down here, power windows, this is the winch, this is the rear auxiliary switch there, 12-volt power ports, some auxiliary ports if you want to add things later, and then this is the air intake for the HVAC system when it's in its recirculate mode. And yep, it even has recirculate right there. On the driver's side, we find a combination LED and analog instrument cluster, and you can rotate through a number of different options in those two segments with a lot of duplication. Over here, we have a cell phone holder. I have my iPhone in there right now. Down here, we have the all-wheel drive switches. We'll talk about this in a moment because some people are confused about turf mode and what exactly it's doing. Over here, we have drive modes, which is kind of cool. So you can see we can cycle through sport, comfort, standard, etc. That's going to affect the engine and a little bit of the transmission programming as well. We then have the headlight controls there, other light controls for the auxiliary lights on the outside, and the dump bed over there on that side. We even have a tilt telescopic steering column, which is quite surprising. And in addition, the bench seat slides forward and backward, although taller drivers might find that the seat is already a little bit close to the steering wheel. As we get this out on the trail, we need to talk about the four-wheel drive system because there is a little bit of confusion, and to be perfectly honest, Polaris isn't helping themselves out with the way they describe this system online, including, and most importantly, turf mode. According to their description on their website, they say that when turf mode is enabled, only one rear wheel is being powered. That is not correct. It has a locking differential in the back. When it is unlocked, it will send power to whichever wheel it wants to. It allows them to spin at different rates, but it is still powering both wheels. It's just an open differential. Now, the front differential, that is a little bit different. When it is engaged, generally speaking, power is going to the rear wheels. It is not a fully locked setup under most situations. However, when there is slip, there is a mechanical progressive action that allows power to start going towards the front and can effectively limited slip axle the front, basically. So it's kind of locked, kind of not locked, but you don't get that binding feel that you would in a vehicle with a fully locked setup. Now, on this trail, you can definitely see what I was talking about with things being a little on the tight side just due to the size of this trail. But I appreciate the fact that when you have the windshield open like this, that the windshield does not stick out beyond the front of the vehicle. Now, clearly, trees that overhang like that, you do have to be careful so you don't break your windshield. I can see that going really wrong. But all in all, it turns pretty tightly, and thanks to the electric power steering, it's pretty easy to navigate even on some of the sketchier trails like this one. And this is definitely a trail I have to use on a regular basis because we have to get down to clean the solar panels for our off-grid setup. So this is something that happens pretty regularly. Sometimes I'll walk down, sometimes I'm lazy and I take the side-by-side. Now, due to the size, weight, and general dimensions of this down even steeper slopes, sometimes it can get just a hint squirrely in the back. That's maybe where I might want to put this in two-wheel drive mode. Of course, you can also just leave the four-wheel drive system in lock mode all the time, and that's going to give you the best traction out on random surfaces like this where there isn't already a marked trail if this is somewhere where you're going. And this is definitely somewhere where we may be going frequently in the future because we are contemplating about a little off-road course right on that little hillside in that area. We also have to come down, check on the well pump, check on whatever else is going on down here, and then also, of course, climb back uphill. That's where you're gonna wanna re-lock the rear. It's gonna give you the best traction on a hill like this. And that's where all 110 horsepower are gonna be a little bit more helpful. Now, I have seen some online chatter about concerns about leaving the rear locked or unlocked all the time. Personally, I prefer the way that this drives and feels out on a trail when the rear is unlocked. Now, the reason they call it turf mode is because if you live in an area where you're worried about your grass looking good, say you have a nice big lawn and you're using utility side by side for yard work and you're driving over the lawn and you don't want to just cause huge potholes and things like that there as you're turning tight corners, that's where that mode is really going to come into play. For this kind of trail work though, you could probably just leave it locked all the time if you were really worried about it. Now, I have to say this transmission does take a bit of getting used to, especially if you've accidentally left it in the sportier modes, because it can get really aggressive. It's just one of those things you have to get used to, and I think most people probably will. It's important to remember that systems like this do use a clutch to engage the transmission and connect it to the engine, so there's a particular speed where that lockup happens, and with bigger and more powerful engines like this, you can end up in a slightly herky-jerky situation at really low speeds, just something to be mindful of. On the subject of the transmission, I do appreciate the fact that park basically is everything. You don't have a separate parking brake, you just stop, you put it in park, and you walk away. No fuss, no muss. Out on wider trails, you can definitely open up the throttle, but there's another thing that I appreciate. We have a soft limit. So right now we're floored and 14 miles an hour is as fast as we can go because I took my seatbelt off there. And that is definitely different than we find in a lot of utility side-by-sides that have a really harsh limit when you don't have your seatbelt buckled. This makes it, I think, actually a little bit more pleasant of a reminder to say, hey, you know, you need to put your seatbelt on, or just be willing to go a little bit slower if you don't want to have your seatbelt on right now because you're just moving across the driveway or whatever. It has that soft limit to make sure it's actually still workable. I would say that this size of trail is really where this side-by-side comes into its own. It has really decent handling, even in the all-wheel drive, four-wheel drive mode, where sometimes you can get somewhat unusual feel out on a trail. And of course, if you're going downhill, you can just deactivate that. Just go rear-wheel drive where you're gonna have the most natural feel. Just doing a little bit of tree trimming here as we go with the windshield. Maybe I ought to close it. There's a little bit of a reach to close if you're driving. Right there, as you can see, you do have to kind of unbuckle, grab the window, then we can, whoops, gotta actually latch it. This is a little bit finicky sometimes. And of course, now I have, there we go. Now it is latched. Now, one of the reasons that this all-wheel drive system feels this way is that when all-wheel drive is engaged, it's firmly locked. So the front and rear inputs can't spin at different rates. The way they deal with that is interesting. They actually overdrive the rear a little bit faster than the front. And that means that it doesn't have that sort of front tugging and front binding that you can sometimes get in some systems. Makes it a little bit easier to deal with. And oddly enough, a little bit like Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system in that way, where you have a slightly different ratio front and rear. Not every side-by-side out there does that, and that does make this a little bit easier to deal with out on these trails. The other thing that it does is, again, the front is not always going to be engaged. So even though we have all-wheel drive on, the input to the front is engaged, but that doesn't mean that power is actually going to the front wheels. There is an interesting mechanical setup. You can do some internet research. There's actually a really cool video by Polaris out there about exactly how the front differential is assembled and functions. But basically, it's a mechanical active engagement to send power to the front whenever it's needed. Like, say we need to climb over this rock here, definitely going to be needed. Oh, we may need actually the winch. Let's see how we go here. I see what happened. So the tree, you can probably see in that front camera there, that tree kind of broke up a little bit as we went over it, but not enough to make the complete going over easy. There we go. Nope, no winching needed. Anyway, back on to the all-wheel drive system. So even though power's going to the front tires are not necessarily fully engaged. It actually requires a little bit of an imbalance in the power in order to get power to go. And then it's kind of a progressive locking mechanism, if you will. When it's fully engaged, when there's power needing to go to the front, the system then effectively has kind of a lock across the front, but there is a little bit of slip allowed right to left. And that's pretty logical because not only does it help improve the basic handling ability of the vehicle, it also helps reduce stress on the front axle. And stress on axles, when everything is fully locked, that's where things start to get broken. There's just so much power from this engine that even on these steeper hill sections where you think you might want to dig deeper, and you definitely would be flooring it in other side-by-sides in here, there's just so much power, it's just spinning all the wheels, you really have to back off on the throttle. Utility vehicles like this are so handy because you can get them in so much smaller places that you'd never be able to fit the average vehicle. And for the random kinds of projects that seems like we find ourselves always working on, this is just about the handiest thing I can think of.
Now, when I'm talking about four-wheel drive capability, clearly I'm talking about that in the context of a utility side-by-side. If you're looking for the ultimate off-highway vehicle to take to your local dune park or just some other kind of OHV park, then you're probably going to want to look at something else, like a Razor in the Polaris lineup. But for me, a side-by-side is about doing work on the weekends or on weekdays, hauling lumber from one place to the other, going to pick up logs and dragging them back uphill, taking the chainsaw out to cut up a tree that's fallen on the road, something along those lines, or simple things like moving a trailer around when I don't have a vehicle either currently parked in my driveway that's good at doing that, or when I need to take a trailer somewhere where it's difficult to park, because I have a 26-foot flatbed, and that flatbed is a pain in the butt to back up with certain vehicles, just because it's relatively long and the bed is 26 feet, or the flatbed portion is 26 feet plus the tongue length. It's a really long trailer and it's a pain to back up if your vehicle doesn't turn tightly. And the Ranger, well, it has 3,500 pounds of towing capability and a 15-foot turning radius. So, I couldn't put anything on my flatbed trailer and pull it around with the Ranger, but you can certainly back it into tight places with the Ranger. Also, the 1,500 pounds of payload capacity is fantastic because it means you really could load it up with logs, firewood, gravel, whatever you might need to carry around your work site or just your yard if you're on a bigger lot on the weekends. And I do appreciate the fact that it's a plastic bed. The tailgate design, that is interesting. It's a little bit more like a pickup truck tailgate with the latch in the back rather than the sort of buckle latches that you find on some side-by-sides. It does appear to be pretty durable, certainly more durable at latching that tailgate than some of those latch designs that I've seen out there on other ATVs and side-by-sides, but it probably is going to be a bit more expensive to repair if something does go wrong. And that's perhaps the next thing we should talk about is the price tag. If you want the entry-level member of the Ranger family, that's $11,499. That's for the Ranger SP570. I like that model because it's really, really compact. So if you want to turn even tighter than about 15-foot circle, you can go for that model. Just keep in mind that all the capabilities will drop down. The next step up from there is the Ranger 1000. That's $13,999. That gets you in a more or less full-size utility side-by-side. There are clearly models that are bigger, but I'll consider that full size for the moment. If you want the crazy engine, then you want the Ranger XD 1500 for $29,999. And the model that we were driving started at $39,999, but ours was $46,000 approximately. Now, clearly, you are getting a lot of side-by-side for your money. A 110 horsepower engine with 105 pound-feet of torque. You're also getting the cab, the heater, the air conditioning, the Polaris Command infotainment system, which has the backup camera, which does make it really easy to back up to a trailer, for instance. Something that I had not necessarily considered before owning a side-by-side myself is that even though, yes, they are quite small, it's still kind of difficult to tell exactly what's going on back there if you're hooking up a trailer. And using my own side-by-side, which clearly is a really, really cheap and cheesy one with no backup camera, sometimes it does take 2 or 3 tries, or you just give up and you just haul the trailer over to the ball on the side-by-side, which is not always the best. Having a backup camera actually is kind of handy. but you're going to have to pay the piper because $46,000 is definitely on the expensive side. And that's why at the beginning of the video, I said this is kind of the 3/4 ton of the side-by-side market, if you will. This is definitely the top end, top capable side-by-side in the utility lineup at Polaris, and it matches really well with some of the ultra expensive options from the competition. But not all the competition will have the kind of capability and kind of feature set that we find here. So if you do want features like air conditioning and a heater, which would definitely be handy in some areas. Again, my parents live in Texas and they have a ranch there. They always use John Deere Gators and they don't have air conditioning or a heater in their Gators. That is something, regardless of what model they bought in the future, that I think they really should consider, because in their area, it definitely gets really cold in the winter sometimes, and it is definitely really hot in the summer. And that just means that those times of the year, you take the Jeep or something else out to do something in the yard, and you leave the side-by-side in the barn because it's just not worth driving with no doors, etc. But again, you're going to be paying for those extra features regardless of the brand of side-by-side that you look at. But I do like some of the other ideas going on in the Polaris Ranger. I think that they've done the software really well. I also like the fact that the transmission has a more durable steel chain than you find in some of the competitive side-by-sides. Admittedly, there's a whole lot more power and a whole lot more torque going on, so how reliable is that long term? I will let all of you sound off down there in the comments section below. And should we try an electric Ranger? Because I will be 100% honest. When I was last side-by-side shopping, I really wanted an electric model. And the main reason for that is a lot of folks I know with side-by-sides, family members, friends, etc., especially carbureted side-by-sides, they're a real bummer to maintain. However, electric fuel injection and electric power steering are definitely two things I would want in a side-by-side if you're shopping for one, and that is going to solve a lot of those reliability problems. The next thing I would say, though, is that an electric side-by-side does have the potential to be really reliable because there's a lot less going on, and you don't ever have to worry about fueling it up. They are a little bit on the heavy side, a little bit on the expensive side, but hopefully we'll be able to get our hands on one at some point in the future. See all of you next week.